developer on the team.
All right, let's get it started. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming and joining us for today's TorontoJS Tech Talk event, online editions. Before we get to the talk today, please allow us to introduce ourselves really fast and talk about code of conduct. First, we are a volunteer-run nonprofit corporations that aims to support all in their journey to learn and share their passion for JavaScript, and of course, by extension, software development. And there's about like 12,000 members on Meetup for virtual and in-person events, around 5,753 members on Slack, over 900 on Guild, and we have about 50 volunteers. If you like to sponsoring us, want to partner up, please let us know and we can talk. Or you can email us through this email address, sponsor@TorontoJS.com. So first, let's talk about upcoming events. There will be one really soon. Next month. That will be Saturday, March 13th. There will be an online JS Tech Talk event, and we'll have our speaker, John Page, and he will talk about the truth of MongoDB. And you can scan the QR code here to RSVP. And most importantly is a code of conduct. We're dedicated to providing an abuse-free, harassment-free event experience for everyone. And we do not tolerate abuse, harassment, or intelligent enlistment in any form. And you can find more details at the link here, torontojs.com/p/code of conduct. And if someone, harass you through DM or in any way, please let me, Sammy, Ken, and Dale to know, or you can report the abuse right at this link here, torontojs.com/pre and /report. And if you'd like to enjoy more about like programming or like get involved more with us, please join us on Slack. And here's the QR code to scan. So yeah, and that's everything for the introduction. And Ken, would you like to introduce the speaker of today?
Thank you, Sammy. I'll try to make it really short. I'd like to thank everybody for coming to TorontoJS on a TikTok today. We're very excited to have my friend and mentor and the Shopify staff developer join us to talk about React testing today. During the presentation, if you have any questions, please use the chat room. And there will also be a specific question period at the end of the presentation and a short networking period after the question period. Hussien, thanks very much for joining us. I'd like to hand over the mic to you.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much, Ken and TorontoJS for inviting me. I do believe this is a very old group because I remember when I was starting, like I was a junior developer, like talk about like maybe 2012 or something like that. I think this group was there and I was attending events. So it's good to come back and give back when I can. So thanks for having me. All right, so can everybody hear me okay? Organizers, good to go? Okay, let's go ahead and start the presentation. There will be some questions that I have for people that I won't be able to see on the chat maybe. So if y'all can just speak up on the organizers and let me know what people say, that would be great. So today we'll be talking about React testing and creating high quality software. Just let me share my screen real quick here. Am I sharing? There we go. Can everybody see that? Good to go. Okay, I have to share my screen, I think, to start. All right. So I'll be talking about React testing and creating high quality software. My name is Hussien Khayoon. I'm a staff engineer at Shopify. I've been there just over 2 years. I've been on various teams. Currently, I'm on the React Shopify Forms app team, but I've been on about 4 or 5 teams so far, so I have a lot of experience on the front end and the back end. That's my Twitter handle there, Hussien@coding, or you can find me on LinkedIn. Feel free to follow me after this, send me a message, say hi. I'm very friendly, so definitely welcome that, especially on LinkedIn or Twitter if you like. So agenda today is going to be talking about a bit about testing, a bit about how we test at Shopify for those interested, some pitfalls and trade-offs to testing, and finally, like a short demo on like React testing itself. So not everything is about React testing. Maybe I was a bit misleading, but there will be a portion there. But I just thought I'd talk about testing in general because I kind of want to, to those who are new to testing, I think it's important to talk about. So questions for you, and this is when I could use the organizers here. So I'll have basically 4 questions here. Maybe you could say 1, 2, or 3, or 4. But basically, I'd like to know who has never tested before. That's 1. Who doesn't have any tests, work at a company that has no tests. Number 2. Who has some testing but not enough. Number 3. And who has some great testing setups, like you got the CI/CD, everything, end-to-end testing, just the works, and you're very proud of it as in your organization or yourself. So let's get 1, 2, 3, 4. Maybe just type it in the chat. Can people type in the chat? All right. Okay. A lot of 3s, some 1s, 3 to 4, 2, 1, 3, 3, 3, 3. Good. Okay. So I think definitely this could definitely help you. I think unless you're the last one, I think you'd find something helpful here. So that's good to know, and thank you for those responses. So let's see here. All right. This is the infamous testing pyramid. You'll see this a lot. You'll hear about this a lot. Maybe you've seen it, maybe you haven't. So I'm glad if I'm the first person to have shown you this. I got this from browserstack.com. There's a lot of variations of this, different levels. But I think I kind of agree with the general sentiment here, which is the foundation of your tests is unit testing. So unit tests are usually the most tests that you have. They're the frontline defense for your software. You'll have a lot of them. And afterwards, you have the integration test, which is how your software works together. I won't cover that as much or at all this time. Some people break this up into multiple layers. You'll see like 5, 6 sometimes here. And I think that's also accurate. And then you have your end-to-end testing, which is your full suite UI test, which I'll touch upon a little bit. And then you'll see your manual test. Maybe you're testing more scenarios that you're like, with the feature that you're doing is very specific and you know that you should manually test that. Those, you can never do the 1,000, 2,000 tests that you might have in your organization manually. I hope you don't. But that's generally the pyramid. One comment about this, I'd say it's not the scale. Usually maybe the bottom part is way bigger and the top part is way smaller end-to-end testing. But I think it's an important concept to kind of like, it's a great analogy to think of it. So with unit tests, like I said, it's your first line of defense and your foundation. And I think there should be a lot of them. And they should work in isolation. This is, not an absolute rule, but a general rule that I think is good. So some of them will rely on each other, but generally speaking, what they shouldn't rely on is something external like an API call. I've seen these a lot happen in tests where you have 3,000 tests you're running. Somebody makes a test that relies on a server call or an external library that breaks or something like that, and you end up breaking your entire test suite and you're unable to submit your code. So those are the general unit tests that I mean and I'm talking about. Here's a very quick example of how we write them at Shopify. This is kind of in our public repos. We'll have our React testing library on Shopify that I'll talk about. So this is generally something that opens a modal. It's not the most useful test, but I think it's a test you'll see a lot. It's just a basic sanity test that when you click a button, you'll be able to check the props on the modal that it's changed to true. And you'll see how we have this mount with Polaris, which is kind of how we mount it to the fake DOM and make sure that our component is running somewhere so that we can test operations on it. So that's an example of a very small UI unit test that you might see. Now, I think the cost of unit testing is something that we have to talk about. I remember once upon a time, somebody told me that, and this was at a company I worked for years ago, and the person said, if you write good enough code, you don't need unit tests. And I was very impressionable at the time, but I somehow was I've written enough software to know that, man, that doesn't sound completely right. And I just don't agree with that statement because no matter how good you write software, you're still infallible. You're still going to make errors. And they do cost time and they can be frustrating. I know that times where I I'm really just frustrated. I think it's the worst times as a developer is writing some unit tests that just don't work for no reason, and you spend more time on the unit test than you do on the feature. But I think that is a cost that's usually worth it. It's because the more time you spend on unit tests now, the less time you'll spend on fixing them later. And they will cost a lot later. And I'll show you a graph. The middle point here is setting up a playbook. This is something that I'm in favor of. Like typically with unit tests is in your organization, you might write your unit test by looking at somebody else's unit tests and how they did it. Well, they might have done it completely wrong, or they might have done it in an outdated way. So what I recommend is if you don't have this and you want to look really good at your company, set up a testing recipe playbook of common scenarios that people have, like opening a modal and closing it, submitting a form. Maybe make some recipe book like that. Maybe ChatGPT can help you if that's allowed in your organization. So that's something I recommend with unit tests. But they're definitely worth writing, especially later on when you're writing new features. This is a graph I didn't get the reference, but I found it online here. Typically, something I think you'll see a lot is the cost. I don't know where people get these numbers, but typically the cost of fixing a bug later is way more expensive than fixing it early on. That's why some people are very adamant about practices like TDD, test-driven development, and writing your tests as early as possible. I'm not against it, but I don't usually do it. Maybe it's just the habits I've built over the years. But typically, finding something early on can be very helpful because later on it could be very costly. And I actually did do a talk at React Berlin called "Lessons Learned from Troubleshooting a Shopping Cart Issue." My former company was a small startup, and I introduced a bug that wasn't caught for I think a couple of years. It was very, very finicky. So if you want to look at that, it's about 8 minutes, and I think maybe unit test could have found this. So the point I wanted to prove here is first of all show you that I've spoken other places, but really it's to show you that these things do cost a lot later on if you don't believe me. Now, moving on just a little bit unit tests before we get back to the demo, we talk about integration tests. Or sorry, not integration test. Continuous integration. Typically, you'll see in smaller, bigger companies, especially, you'll run your unit tests through a pipeline. How we do it is when you open a pull request, usually a group of things run. One of them is your tests, and we make sure that they run and that they're done before after even if you get a review, the unit tests all pass, and then you're able to merge afterwards. You can see in our Shopify engineering blog, Faster Shopify CI, we talk about BuildKite, which is the tool we use. I really like it a lot for our large scale. So typically what you'll see in unit tests is, they need to run at a specific time. We shouldn't rely on just running them ourselves. So typically this is a fail-safe system that says, we'll run this when you're about to merge to make sure you didn't break anything. And I feel like this is a very commonly adopted approach by organizations building software. So integration tests, how your services talk to each other. I'm not going to touch upon it here just because I wanted to talk about something that I thought was also interesting. Not particular unit tests or UI tests, but stress testing and how we do it at Shopify. If you're not familiar, this is how you kind of see how your system handles load. Now, why this is important to us is because of Black Friday, Cyber Monday. We get a lot of traffic. You can see from our PR post online that there was about 4.2 million sales per minute on Black Friday. You could imagine a 10-minute outage could cost you 40 million. Not very good for our merchants, not very good for anyone. So typically what we do is we hit our systems with a ton of requests for a period of time to see how they react and see what they do. You can see that in our engineering blog, we have the scale performance testing. I highly recommend you read it if you're interested in how we do it. I think this diagram is worth 1,000 words here from that blog post about how we have different systems and how we hit them. For example, the one that's most user-facing, 35 million requests per minute for 60 minutes, and we see how it does. We'll see the systems that fail, and we'll see like the weak points in our system and where potentially issues can happen. For example, you could say if there are a system where you have a lot of jobs happening, well, the jobs take way too long, and people aren't getting their feedback for hours, for example. So that's maybe an area that you can improve, batch process, whatever, right? That's just an example that I can think about where this could be helpful. So that's something that I think that if your organization isn't doing, even if you're doing a lot of front-end testing, load testing could be very helpful. Now it depends. You might be in an organization where you have a lot of users, sometimes you don't. Some organizations have like very little users who pay a lot of money. And this could also be useful depending on the scenario. The last thing I'll talk about before I demo things is like end-to-end testing. Now, you won't find a lot of stuff written publicly here that our company does, so I won't speak as much. But generally, you'll have tools called Selenium, Cypress, Playwright is a very common one right now that people are using. And these will simulate your UI as accurately as possible, and we'll try to go through the motions. I remember my first internship at IBM. I actually did this for an IDE called Eclipse, for those of you who are familiar with it. So Eclipse is not Eclipse, it's a paid version of Eclipse that IBM called Rational Application Developer, which took about 45 minutes to start up on my screen sometimes in the morning on my Lenovo back then. This was like circa 2011. So, but those essentially ran once a night, and they went through all the UI scenarios that a person would do manually. So these are the slowest tests that you'll have, and they're probably the hardest to write and maintain because they can break very, very easily. They could be sometimes brittle, but they're very important, especially considering what I call, or what people call, your happy path. Your happy path is essentially your most important scenarios that you can't live without. For example, an e-commerce site, I should be able to add a product to my cart, and I should be able to check out, right? If I can't do that, there's a huge problem. So that's a very good scenario for a happy path, but maybe like adding a second address to my account, maybe that's not, you can argue that maybe isn't a happy path. So maybe it's not as important to test, and maybe you can test it in other ways, right? Unless that's a very important thing for your organization, or unless you have an entire team just writing these. But if you're the only people writing these are developers, I think it's important. Now, manual testing, I'll say that it depends on your organization. I've been in organizations where we had a QA team, and I've had organizations like now we don't have really a QA team. So your manual testing has to be very developer driven. And unfortunately, developers I find, are terrible at finding mistakes in their own code. They'll be like, it's fine, it's fine. So it really does take some kind of different mentality to find mistakes. And that's where I find a QA team is very good. Although, it depends on the standards that you set for yourself and your team. It depends on the CI system, the end-to-end testing that you have set up could also help mitigate the things that you would do manually. Sometimes even testing parties you could have could be a good approach. If you're about to release a big feature, you can get like a lot of people in a room. They, call a bug hunt. We used to do in my last company. We find it very useful for doing things and having like a reward system even for it. So pitfalls. Testing doesn't come without, I think, some kind of issues that could happen, or trade-offs. I wanted to really like burn this in your brain. Lots of unit tests doesn't mean your tests are good. So you could have thousands of unit tests, and they could be testing things that are nonsense. I've seen code bases where it's like the same test with a different name, and I'm so confused. I'm like, somebody just copy and pasted this by accident. And a lot of people do copy and paste tests. Like I've been guilty of it. I find things where people are, or we're just like testing meaningless things. And it doesn't, basically, it can give you a false sense of confidence. You're like, 2,000 tests, what I need to worry about. And you could be very wrong. So that all comes down to, I think, one big part is code reviews, is making sure that your developers are looking at tests. And I think part of when you're getting your code reviewed, I think it's a good idea to explain maybe some parts of your test to people, maybe in comments, either on the PR itself or in the code, depending on how your specific team standards are. But I think that this usually holds true. It definitely could be that they are good tests. Other pitfalls I want to talk about are overlapping tests, or just a comment. Now you'll find that I think a good comment people have is you'll have end-to-end tests, manual tests, integration tests, load tests, unit tests. Some of them test the exact same thing. And you're like, why am I running 5 tests for one thing? And that's a good point. I think that does happen. I think tests do overlap. And sometimes maybe you do want that, depending on how important it is. And sometimes you don't want that. So this really comes down and it's kind of subjective to how your team does things. And maybe some things you want to over test and some things you want to just unit test. And sometimes generally, I would say the more edge cases they come, I think those are more towards unit tests and maybe leave those out for the end-to-end tests, maybe integration. So that's just a comment I would say that, and there's a common thing that people bring up. The other thing is code coverage. I've seen very polar opposite opinions on these. What I will tell you is I usually am of the rule, I don't follow absolutes. And when somebody tells me a language is bad, a framework is bad, an approach is bad, I usually say it's bad in certain scenarios and good in others. Code coverage, I think what's interesting about it, for those of you who don't know, it's how much of your code is tested. There's usually like tools that you can get for free. Jest has this, I believe, and you could just add a code coverage option and it tells you how much percentage of your code is being tested. Now, if you know, a good indicator I would say is if it's saying like 10% of your code is tested, I would say that's maybe something that you should look at. Maybe 10% is too little. But the thing is, do you need to reach 100% test coverage? I don't think that's a good indication either. And actually going from like 80 to 100% code coverage is not, I don't think is worth the time, because some things just, you don't need to go that far into it, and it will cost you way too much time. I was on a team that did about 80% code coverage, which proved to be fairly good depending on the scenario, right? There were some exceptions and you were able to say like, this file don't apply the code coverage rule for. And that's, I think, how generally ESLint rules work and these linting rules, and I think is a fairly good approach. The last thing I say is slow tests. You know, you can have very good tests, but if they're very slow, and remember the CI section, your tests all need to run before you merge. If they're taking, you know, first 5 minutes, then 10 minutes, and eventually they kind of creeps up on you, and it's taking like 50 minutes, and you can't deploy things that are like important. So I would say like keep a very close eye on these, and if they are taking a long time, a good way to make you look good in your organization is to come say, hey, they were taking 40 minutes and I did something and they're now taking 20 minutes. And if you think about it, if your organization has like 100 developers, 200 developers, if you're saving them each on their PR like 10 minutes, think about that, right? You write that down, you say, I did that. You know, everybody appreciates it and it makes you look good. So that's something to think about and should be part of your tech debt, in my opinion. Now, here we come into the short demo that I'm going to run about React testing itself. So first off, I'm going to talk about specifically our Polaris library. If you're not familiar with Polaris, it's Shopify's kind of a version of Material UI. This is our internal system that we use that's available publicly. It's meant specifically, I think, for admin dashboards, but you can build any kind of UI with it. It's a lot of stuff, design system, tokens, a lot of things are kind of figured out for you. And it makes our life easier when we work. So I'm going to show an example based on that. The second thing I'm going to show you is our React testing library here. This is all open source. Why we use this one in particular is only because we want more custom matchers. We want things that are more tailored to us. We do release it so other people can use, and it makes my life convenient because I can show you. But you definitely don't have to use it. So I built this very simple application, and actually, if you want to see the full render ATL, I actually go through all of this whole thing, and maybe you can even share links after. It was about like an hour presentation, but I'll just show you like some simple highlights. So I'm going to show you how to test a few things using some Jest and our test matchers. One thing here that I'll show you is you can add something like a name, say location. So we're going to test that works. We're going to test that the delete works. We're going to test that the search works. And I think that things like opening links like this and how we can do things like that. Okay, so I'm going to run through a few scenarios. If you don't understand them or you don't get them right away, that's okay. But I'm just going to give you a glimpse into like how we do it. So as per the instructions, I'll show you like the first test here that can test you like a simple link. In this case, when we click on this footer, it's going to take us to this Polaris site. So here's one way of testing it. Obviously, I don't think it's the most bulletproof way, but it's one way of testing it. After you mount the component, you give a name to the test. we can actually here we could find the specific footer component, and we can look at the specific props of it and make sure that it leads to that link. Now, things that I like to do is maybe not hard code a link, maybe have that somewhere in a list of links that you have. But this is just for all intents and purposes, just showing an example. I'm sorry, my mouse might be a bit laggy, so you'll see kind of like it's stuttering a bit just because I think I have something interfering with the signal. The second thing here I'll show you is opening a new window. Like when you click Explorer, one way you can test this, one tool that you have at your disposal with Jest is the spy on. Essentially, you can look into a specific object like window.open. In this case, we're looking at window.open and we want to see certain expected behavior with that function call. So in this case, we can find the specific button in Polaris. They're called actions. So this is called like a secondary action. So this is the primary action. This is the secondary action. That's just like Polaris language. And then what we can do here is I make sure that the actual action exists. And then I get the first action because there could be many. And then I try to open it. And then I kind of spy on the result or look at the result and make sure that it's actually called with a specific argument that's blank so that I know that the window.open method actually got called with the arguments that I expected it to be called with. So that's one way of testing as well. But let's talk about like something a little more complicated, like essentially opening up the small world, putting in results and seeing something. So one way you could test this that's very common, and I'll show you some of this is the code version of all of this. You can actually find, again, the button on the page, and you'll see here something called Raptor.act. Actually, .act is a pretty useful method where you can essentially ensure that your DOM has reacted to the actual event that you put it through. In this case, we're finding something, but we're also triggering an on-change event, which is adding the name itself to the field. So when you type in new customer or new user, I wrote in Hussien K, and this is actually triggering that, but we make sure that that's actually done before we move on. Some people put in the same wrapper.act, but I just did it for like demonstration purposes that you can do it. And then finally, I find the button after we filled out the information. So again, I'm filling out the form through tests, and then I'm finding the click button, which should be disabled until there's actual fields in the form. And then I actually look for all the rows, and I make sure that I have an extra one. So I had 2 to start with. So when I add a new one, I should have 3 now. So that's all my test is doing. And that's just a basic sanity test about something getting added. Now, again, you might be doing function calls, API calls to do this. And that's where mocking falls in. I remember in this workshop, I didn't have time to do a full GraphQL mock like we do in our internal code base. It would have taken me hours. So I was gonna let you imagine mocking your API calls. But again, you see what this opens up for is other scenarios. For example, I mentioned that if somebody didn't fill out the form properly or missed a field, that this shouldn't work because the button should be disabled. So when you try to click the button, nothing happens. So then you could say like, okay, I should just have 2 rows if that happens. You can add specific validation. Like you can say like, maybe somebody filled out the name was too short, so that you can also say like that doesn't submit the form. So those are other things that you can start adding, and these are the edge cases that you can keep adding and adding on top of this, and you can keep testing. Now let's talk about the search a little bit. So you can use a very similar methodology to test this functionality. And again, building on what we just said. So if I come back to this and look at this test case, we could essentially trigger an on-change event, add a search term, and then see, for example, if we have a row matching based on the data that we are providing, and this is mock data, that there's only 1 row left with that specific name. So we have a basic idea that the search functionality is kind of working in the UI. And then, for example, you could do the same if nothing matches. So if nothing matches, you know, this empty state should come up, okay? So again, they're not the most complete tests, but they're testing enough units of your code that if you do something in your code that breaks this by accident, you could catch it. And I think that's where these become very, very valuable in multiple units. I think the next thing I wanted to talk about is, testing a hook. So actually how this thing works is it's using a React hook that just for illustration purposes, I was managing the state through this hook. And I think is the whole point of me doing this is to show you that when you test hooks, it's a bit different because a hook usually is in a component. And you don't want to make an entire component just to test your hook. So typically, we don't use this one, but this is available and it has the same idea. This render hook helper that you have in React hooks testing library, which allows you to essentially render a hook on the fly in your test case and then test the logic of it. In this case, I have 2 items and then I want to end up with 3 items because I added one. And then I can also remove one and see that I'm back with 2. And then the actual item itself is gone. So again, this is testing your specific hook. If you're writing a lot of React these days, you might be writing a lot of hooks. So I think you can test them separately and also test them as part of your code. And that's the last thing I want to show is mocking specific libraries. I do not like just.mock that much. It is very nuanced and it has a lot of issues sometimes, and it's giving me a lot of headaches. But if you want to help your team and make that recipe book I was talking about, or the playbook where you can show people how to mock specific parts. So in this case, I'm actually mocking my hook for illustration purposes, and showing you how you can mock a specific, even method from it, which for me is add items. So if you look at here, I'm actually mocking the add item method because sometimes you don't actually care about what happens in the hook in your specific test. Maybe that's in another test. All you want to see is that it's being called with the right information. And what this is doing here is just making sure that that specific method from the hook is being called, and also, or the function, and that also it's being called with the right data. So in this case, it's actually with the right arguments that I sent through. So again, just.mock could be a very, very important tool for not going, because in your unit test, sometimes you don't want to go too deep and test every single thing. You just want to test things on the surface to make sure, other things are working. Because maybe the hook has to be used, maybe there's like 5 hooks called, but you just don't care about those 4 of those 5 hooks in that specific unit test. So it's good to mock things out sometimes and not have to set up everything all over again. And maybe leave that to a more, integrated version of a UI test or a unit test. But yeah, I think that pretty much sums things up in terms of what I wanted to show. So I think I will leave it up to questions. And again, you can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Twitter with this handle. Send me a message, follow me, whatever. I'm happy to connect. Yes.
So as discussed earlier, quite a few of our guests are either trying to get into tech or maybe earlier in their career. So many people here will probably have to have some kind of project to present when they're looking for work. And so I'm wondering, and as you touched on already, testing is very time consuming. So I'm assuming making choices is important. You probably can't go for volume. You're probably looking at quality tests over full coverage, right? So my question is, what are the things you would be looking out for as, say, a hiring manager? Like, for example, like test-driven development. Are you looking for one type of test of each, end-to-end unit test, for integration test? Do you give bonus points if they set up a basic continuous integration chain where there's automated tests happening with GitHub Actions, or so like what do you think that someone should be like, what would be the hierarchy of importance in terms of their personal project to demonstrate their skills?
Yeah, no, great question, Ken. I think this is like a very like I have a few opinions on this. Like, it's a subjective matter what makes a project good. Maybe a lot of these times, let's say a take home that you get. And if I get a take home, for example, I don't like doing them. I'd rather just do the interview and and get it over with. But I know when I was first starting out, I was terrified of live coding interviews, and I preferred to do take home assignments. And the thing is with a take home assignment, somebody out there is maybe outdoing you. So you're always thinking about, like, I have to be the best one. So sometimes, like, what I used to like to do, and would still do, is add unit tests. and add some kind of CI on GitHub to show that my unit tests are running. There's like the whole test passing little badge. I think we talked about that before. And that would make your project look good. But in general, like I know that the thing that people do with projects is the features might be impressive, but also what's impressive is the fact that you understand testing is important in software development. So maybe if your project does like 5 features or you want to do 5 features, maybe do 4 and then maybe start writing some tests. Maybe spend that time. And that's what you'll find in actual software development in the real world is people or you get rushed in general by just the business side of an organization to build, and you're not testing properly. You're like, I'll test later, I'll test later. Guess what? That later usually never happens. And if it happens, it's like at the worst time. So writing unit tests, even starting off when you don't have time, keep them very basic, do basic unit tests. And if you want to do end-to-end testing, it's a good thing to learn and to show. Like if your project is so like, oh, here's a link to all my tests running, people can see that. Here's a link to all my UI tests. I think maybe UI tests is a bit very far, unless it's like you really care about that project. I wouldn't do them for a personal project, but I would write unit tests, at most. But if I'm showcasing to somebody for the purposes of hiring me, I think unit tests generally look fairly impressive, especially if you got them running and showing like a test pass badge, which is usually pretty cool because most people don't do that. And the things that distinguish you are the things that most people don't do.
Do we have more questions? Dale?
This is kind of, I guess, related to the idea of code coverage. Is it worth, in your opinion at least, writing a test for every single component? Because sometimes you have like one component that's made of like of 5 leaf node components, like your basic building blocks, and it kind of feels like I'm just testing those same leaf nodes again, this time just wrapped up in another component that's rendering them. Is there like a strategy in terms of like knowing this is maybe something that worthwhile for writing tests? Maybe this isn't really worth my time.
Yeah, great question. I think I've definitely wrestled with this and just having myself like a general rule, like, oh, I should test every single file, but then I realize like all I'm testing in this file is like this word renders. Like, is that very useful? So I tend to agree that now I just kind of see like, okay, like if there's not specific important logic or UI logic, like if it's a button that opens something with some kind of state, I'll usually test it. If there's some kind of even a little bit of state, I'll test it. Even if there's like a little branching logic, I think it's sometimes worth adding. But generally, yeah, like if I can write one test that could do it all, like I'd be more happy with that. However, it does get a bit confusing depending on how you structure your projects, right? Because a person might think, oh, this isn't tested, but actually the test for it is in that one. There's no real way of knowing. And I guess that's the trade-off of all that is that you think that it's not tested, but then it's actually tested. But then I think it'll show itself eventually if it's not tested. But yeah, I think that there is a trade-off there. Either test every single file or test them as a group, and then maybe people will get lost.
You see, you touched on like the time it takes for tests, and that might be a factor in whether you want to introduce certain type of tests, especially in the CI. So, are there companies or that you worked at or you work at now where they have a different suite of tests depending it's for development or for their CI?
I think that what you'll find, and I hope I'm on the right track to your question, is maybe like end-to-end tests, you don't run them in your CI because they take way too long. So I know that some companies, like when I was at IBM, we did like I think we ran them like once a night. But this is completely up to you. But the thing is like the heavier tests are, like your load tests, like maybe you shouldn't run those like on your CI, but maybe you should have specific intervals in which you run your load tests, specific or whether it doesn't have to be every day, but it could be like once a month, right? And that's something that like never have to, like my general rule on that is don't have to like don't remind yourself by being like, oh, I'll remember. That'll never happen, right? Like have it scheduled in some way, have some software that reminds you, that tells you like, you should be doing this. I think that CI is important. Development wise, do you run your own tests for development? Sometimes, but I think generally like whatever tests I run in my development, they're all like I look at the individual tests when I'm writing it in development, like the 5 or 6 new tests I'm writing, but the CI will run the rest of them. I'll never run all my unit tests in my dev environment, right? I'll let the CI do that. Because I just think like it's gonna do it anyways. Right. And sometimes, yeah, like it'll fail somewhere and I'll just go back and fix it and it'll just be like good to go.
Do we have any more questions? Also, there's a question in chat, I think. Curtis? 1 second. Curtis has a question in chat. Yeah, so do or can you work remote?
Okay, do or can you work remotely? I mean, at Shopify, I think I think it's like digital by design. So yeah, like you can look into that. Like I think we post about that publicly. Kind of like ever since the pandemic, we've been working from home. So yeah, that's definitely something I prefer. After many years in the industry, I think that we do have periodic meetups of our team, which I think are important. At this stage in my career, that's what I prefer. I think that when you're first starting out, it might be a little bit more isolating to work that way, especially if you need a lot of help. I know even if I join a new organization, I know working from home is a bit harder in the beginning, but then you can get used to it. So that's my thoughts. I hope we're touching on that. And then QA tester job market, it's hard for me to say because I'm not in that market. Generally speaking, it's good to see the basic numbers on these and job postings and how often new ones come out per day. I think that's a good way of looking at it. Like, I know like once upon a time, I was arguing with somebody about React Native versus Flutter. I had no problem conceding that Flutter was way better. But I was like, let's look at the job market. There's like 2 Flutter jobs and 500 React Native jobs at the time. Like that also has to influence your decision sometimes with technology. Is that kind of thing? It's not just always because the technology is better. Will it catch up? Like if you're not sure, like I'm the kind of person, if I'm not sure now, like I hate guessing the future. You should just, that's why I always go with index funds of the stock market because I don't know how to guess.
Yeah, I think we would all be out of work if it was about the quality of the programming language we're working with. I think we might have one more question. Let's see. Do you have an automated test to validate web performance in Shopify, for instance, JavaScript execution time in browser? This is from Samantha Martinez.
That's highly up to the teams themselves. It depends on which part of the team. I think like we do have, without going into like detail that I may not be able to talk about, but I think that we do track these definitely. Like we do, like one big thing that we do is we see things before they happen by tracking times of almost everything. And that's a responsibility of your team. I like to see things like how much requests are taking on average, how long pages are loading. And I think every team should kind of set that up in a big organization, especially even a small one, just to see like, because like the last thing, the worst thing about how we test as developers is we'll be like, okay, like on my 16 gig MacBook with my perfect internet connection, everything is running great, right? But then the person who has like, one of your biggest customers who has like, destroying your database and has a lot of a lot of data and running on a slow connection, maybe you should test it that way as well. Which is what those indicators will tell you about like, okay, well, the page is running slow on average for most people or a certain amount of people. And that will inform you that means you have to do something. And you can even set alerts and triggers, and every organization, like I've been in the past like 8 years, we've done things like that where you set up like triggers It's for things like when certain metrics are hit, like the threshold for errors. So you can set it up again for your threshold for speed of your web page. I don't know about accessibility testing and if we automate that. Sorry, I'm not sure. But we do really care about accessibility. People I've worked with them. I know I came from a startup environment, which wasn't very, didn't pay much attention to that. But at Shopify, we do pay a lot of attention, and a lot of my colleagues have taught me about accessibility testing and how important that is. And setting up my, screen reader and going through and realizing like, wow, the thing I built, I need to do a better job because it's not really usable with just my keyboard. So that's typically how how we go about it, but automation wise, I'm not sure. Any questions?
Any last questions? Maybe one last question. If not, we can move on to a short meet and greet. Also, if anybody wants to network, feel free to share your socials in the chat. Any other questions?
And I gotta say, I finished 7-11, so that was pretty good. I was only 1 minute extra. Not bad.
Hello? Hello?
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, we can hear you.
One question, what might you be suggesting learning for, like one quick run through of skills to learn for this market? In terms of QA, because I have experience in PyTest, and I have
But Curtis, Hussien is not a quality analyst specialist, so I think this question is not for this. It's not for this.
sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. Like definitely I don't have as much experience, but the general rule that I follow, Curtis, is look at the job postings for QA jobs and what technologies they're generally asking for. That's usually a pretty good indicator of what you should learn, in my opinion. And I've heard some good advice about even when you're looking for a developer job, maybe in the area you're in, people do more Java, and maybe you should learn more of that, especially if you're a beginner and you're learning a lot more React and Node.js, and maybe your area is not like a Node.js area. I don't know about Toronto in general. It's a pretty big city, but not everybody here is from Toronto, I assume.
All right, I think we can move on to maybe a brief networking session. So Hussien, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today. Great presentation. I learned a lot. Hope to have you again in the future. Thank you for all of your time today. I think we can put an end to the recording now.